Dr. Bolger, thanks for joining us today. I'd love to start by letting the listeners get to know you a little bit. Could you tell us more about yourself and what drives you?
Sure. I am an associate professor at the University of Maryland currently, and I am also the director of the Maryland Initiative for Literacy and Equity, which is a new institute we'll probably get into talking about. But I started my, journey in literacy back when I was an undergrad at the University of Massachusetts. And I was always interested in how we think, so I studied psychology and education. I said, well, I'll either become a teacher or start to go to grad school and understand deeper how we think and how we learn. And I got the opportunity when I was at the University of Massachusetts, and in the 90s, it's the bastion of reading research. I got the opportunity to work with Mike Royer, who was an educational psychologist there, who was running intervention studies with children with reading disability. And I got to see firsthand the impact on individual children of intervention and what those cognitive components of intervention and explicit practices and obviously spelling sound relationships. And I got to see children make such great gains. And in some of that work, I saw the light that parents would describe. The light's gone off in my child's eyes, and all of a sudden see within a couple months, the light come back on. And so that's really how I started kind of my career in this path in literacy. At the same time, it was interesting that the brain imaging era had kicked off, especially in literacy. And the Shawitzes and others were putting out some of the first brain imaging studies on dyslexia. And some of that work codified the idea that dyslexia was a condition that was persistent, and the implications about remediation or intervention were in question. And there were different ideas thrown around at that time as before, that maybe they'll never learn to read like normal children. And seeing the work that we had done and seeing the great intervention effects that we had gotten, I said, oh, this isn't right. The brain is plastic. And that's really what kicked off my desire to really understand that plasticity, that brain plasticity. So I went off got the opportunity to go to graduate school and did my doctorate at the Learning Research Development Center at the University of Pittsburgh, and study with Chuck Perfetti and Isabel Beck and Monty McGowan and others, and really study the development of reading, both at the word level as well as at the vocabulary and comprehension level, but really got to start to poke into the brain and see what's happening in the brain and see the changes that happen. So that really was kind of the snowball of my career. Then I went off to Northwestern University, where I got to do a postdoc in the communication sciences and disorders department there with James Booth and others. But I really got a great integration into speech and language pathology from all of the great faculty there, and really understood language acquisition deeper. After spending a couple of years there, I came here and got my first faculty position, and I've stayed here ever since at the University of Maryland, and have been in a college of education doing teacher preparation, as well as continuing to do research on brain imaging, and but also being more in the classroom as well. So doing both teacher preparation and now a lot of professional development, and with the work with Milo of really just integrating that knowledge about literacy and across the board in school.
It's fascinating to hear that you started out with children being that lightning rod for you to be able to jump into, we can make a difference in the lives of humans. We can teach. There is hope. That has stayed with you to now supporting the people who are on the front lines of making sure that kids learn how to read. And throughout that, you also were there at the beginning of Shaywitz's work. What was that like to be at the beginning of the brain has neuroplasticity? Can you talk to the listeners about that? Because we're going back in time.
Yeah, and this was right at the culmination of the decade of the brain, as it was dubbed, and the era of modern brain imaging, as well as the National Reading. Mm-hmm. And my mentors and others were also involved in the preceding National Research Council Preventing Reading Difficulties that culminated in the Snowbirds and Griffin book. But the being in the field during that very kind of pivotal time has been so interesting. And this was also pre-IDEA, right? So the children that I was working with in Massachusetts and up until 2004, right? This was before least restrictive environment, right? That was the era of what was called warehousing, and seeing the issues that arise with what happens when there's low expectations, no expectation, again, that this is a persistent condition and that we shouldn't expect much from these children, to, really trying to understand that, no, the brain is plastic, and, these children are intelligent. And there are so many factors that kind of culminated at that time and since, that it's been exciting and fascinating. Some of my early work, even in Pittsburgh, was getting to be on a project with Barbara Foreman and Jack Fletcher and the group down when they were at Houston, looking at the early studies of response to intervention. And so they were really digging into those first studies of seeing what the response to intervention models look like in literacy. Screening at kindergarten, intervening through first grade. They have some brain imaging data of that as well that came out in those early days, the early 2000s. So really being at the crux of that start of response to intervention, early intervention, getting rid of the wait to fail model, getting rid of the, IQ discrepancy model. Hopefully we have now finally gotten rid of that. But there's so many aspects of that have been kind of foundational, and just being a part of that has been something that is, I think, for me, for my career, this has been so exciting and so pivotal.
One thing that's really exciting about having you on today and having this be a series is that we in America and across the world, because Educate's On the Road to Literacy Success podcast has actually been able to hit very well in Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. Get to know you, your history, and how your work will continue to support the work that we do in the classroom. So thank you for providing that comprehensive look at the work that you've done, the people you've collaborated with. You are such an incredible human being and researcher. I feel like I'm with a Taylor Swift of neuroscience. Thank you, Dr. Bolger.
Yeah, so it's funny that one of the things that I will also say, I'm married to a special education teacher of 25 years who is dedicated, one of the most talented educators out there. And I'll say this as a sense of just intellectual humility. And I think about this a lot. Now, obviously, our spouses, always will humble us, but just the fact that, hearing on a nightly basis too, is like the notion of, you get to look at the averages. You get to look at the, exclude the outliers. She said, in education, my job, I work with the outliers. You have to understand the kids. You have to, understand the individual. And so I think one of the other pieces of my life is really embracing that sense of, as a scientist, there's a limitation to what I know. And really, I think this part of my career, I've really tried to spend looking at that other side, right? Is what is it that the scientists, there's that translation piece of translating our work to the practitioners, but also really embracing what is it that the practitioners have to tell us. And I think this part of my career, I think, we reached that point where we said, okay, I've done this, I've built this kind of career on this meaningful career, but really, what's the most meaningful thing to me now? And I think that, the place where I've gone is to understand that piece, right? Is to really embrace what is it that the practitioners have to say and to learn, to contribute to the science, to help us to better translate.
Excellent. Well, that's phenomenal. So let's talk about the science of reading movement. This is an exciting time in literacy with the science of reading movement gaining momentum. It would be great to hear your perspective. What do you think this current movement is getting right?
So, yeah, and I think there's different aspects. And obviously, as a reading scientist, I'm seen as one of the people who is in that box. But I also am very cautious as a I think alluded to in my previous comment, that there's a lot about the science of reading movement that we have to be careful of. And one is that I think that intellectual humility is something that we want to be sure of, right? Because as Fiero would say, this is really the science of how kids learn to read, right? That's what part of the science of reading movement was, really just getting out there, the science of how children learn to read. And I usually like to use the term evidence-based practices. One of the goals that I've had as being in starting the Maryland initiative for literacy and equity is to really kind of embrace, in some ways, I want to say, I use the term a medical model or medical school model, but of really elevating the practice of teaching to that of doctors and even speech and language pathologists and psychologists and psychiatrists, I guess, that there's a lot of basic knowledge that go into understanding how children learn to read. Louisa said reading is rocket science. I always have a little slide that says, no, reading is actually brain science. And understanding how complex the brain is, from my perspective, really illustrates the fact that it is complex, right? It is complicated. And I go back to when we look at the simple view of reading, and it's always been a useful model back in the 80s to kind of illustrate the idea that you have to have the word recognition and the comprehension. But when I give a lot of my presentations, I pull out the Perfetti blueprint of a reader model and just show how complicated all the little boxes and arrows that go together to, to enable reading to happen. I said, it's not a simple view, and it is complex, and it's intertwined and interactive. Obviously, the reading rope is a little deeper into that, but again, is a simplification for how complex it really is. But I think one of the ways of elevating both the profession of teaching and getting the populace at large to really understand that teachers are doing brain science in a way, and also bringing that to ensure that teachers have that basic knowledge, just like our doctors and others have to have, of chemistry and biology, understanding how the cells work, even though they don't do that on a daily basis. But that tells them, oh, this is why vaccines work, right? This is why this, this drug will work. This is why this treatment is working. Or this is why the virus is doing this to your body. I think that getting teachers to understand the science of how children learn to read is really critical. It's that background, it's that basis that enables them to understand why things will work. I think it's also important for them to understand, just as doctors do. And I always say, doctors aren't practicing bloodletting anymore, right? Because we know that practice is outdated. We aren't doing wide-scale lobotomies anymore, right? There are better practices. And that's because the science and the evidence is just that. It's always providing new evidence of what's better, of what works best. And so I always try to use the term evidence-based best practices, and that teachers, by understanding what are the kind of tenets of how kids learn to read, and they can understand the evidence-based best practices based on those tenets of, what's the science on how things work. It's also important for them to understand that science is always changing, right? That science is, and it's not just flip-flopping as we see these pendulum swings in education. The science is more iterative, in that it's not that we're overturning decades of understanding and now things are totally different. It's science is usually tweaking at the edges. An analogy would be that Einstein came up with the theory of relativity. It replaced, in some ways, Newtonian physics, for anybody who has studied those concepts, but it's not a complete overturning. It's just a new perspective. But, it's not that the basic tenets of Newtonian physics don't work. High school teachers can still do those illustrative things of Newtonian physics in their classrooms every day. I think that when we get teachers to understand those basics, it also enables their art of teaching. But I think that one of the things that we get right in the science of reading is some of the ideas of learning is explicit, that there has to be explicit teaching and modeling, that we need to look at skills and focus on foundational skills. And we need to build those skills and then integrate those skills. And I think that when it comes to being data driven and understanding that individual children have unique sets of strengths and weaknesses within those skills and abilities, and that when you look at intervention, that when you look at those different skills and abilities, that really trying to intervene on those specific skills and abilities is where things focus should go, and that we don't just put all kids who are struggling into one big basket. So I think that's some of the pieces of evidence-based practices of the science of reading that I think are really foundational to understand.
So intellectual humility, explicit instruction, teaching as modeling, building skills. I like to say by skill, by scholar. So moving away from clumping. So I'm hearing you say that. Be really adept and attuned to that. Monitor your data. Make adjustments based upon what kids need. I like how you said science is just nipping at the edges and it's an iterative process. So those pieces are very, very helpful. This is not a pendulum swing, also very important. So there's just so much to listen to there. I wonder if listeners will be just like myself, heading back and reviewing all of the components that you were saying. These are the things that we're getting right currently. Let's move into what you think we may be misinterpreting. What are we missing?
So I think there's a lot about the science of reading. And obviously, like I said, one of the reasons I tend not to like to use the term is that it's become a moniker, and you can slap it on books and slap it on curricula and say this is thus approved by some authority that says this follows the science of reading. I think that one of the pieces that when we talk about evidence-based practices, again, it's that we know that these practices will tend to lead to the most gains for the most children, and that when looking at children who are not gaining, there are particular ways in which we can intervene. I think that even coming from those decades of the 90s and early 2000s, when the battle of direct instruction, and direct instruction is a dirty word in some parts of the world, and thus you couldn't say that word in colleges of education. And I think even what direct instruction gets right is that explicitness, that skills-based focus. I think we also talked a lot about fidelity. And this gives the notion that the answer is in the script, and that, if you just follow this script, that's what is, that is really the answer. That's what's making this intervention work, is the script. And I think therein lies one of the difficulties that I think the science of reading really needs to be sure to pull away from, right? Is there's a difference between the script and the principles, or what my colleagues would call the active ingredients, is that there are particular active ingredients of what makes a good intervention, or even good instruction, good curriculum. But, the specifics of the script are not the magic. That's not where the magic is, right? And the magic is in those principles and those active ingredients. And so I think just like people have argued with phonics, and this is the key scope and sequence. It's like, right, what are the principles of the scope and sequence, right? Going from more simple to more complex right? But there's no, in the science, there's no study that showed this particular scope and sequence is better than this one. It's this script is better than this particular one. It's more that when it has these active ingredients, these active components, that's what's effective. I think that the science really, in many ways, has to yield to, or in this way, what we call even today implementation science, right? And that gives teachers the agency and empowers them to really, do that art, right? Just doctors have the art of medicine, teachers have the art of teaching, and it allows them to have that art of teaching. And I think about what does that look like? And my daughter's kindergarten teacher, right after Finding Dory came out, the sequel to Finding Nemo, and in order to get kids to learn how to stretch and hear the sounds of words, she said, she showed them the clip from Finding Dory, and Dory's talking like a whale, and she goes, hello, right? But that's the art of teaching. The principle, the active ingredient she understood, and she was using her knowledge and her artistic, her imaginative capacity, her teacher agency to really engage her students, contextualize for her students. But I would say that works in that context. But if you have a context of children who will have different cultural expectations, cultural competencies, that those teachers in those areas know kids. So how can they engage kids? Oh, I even think of the Right to Read movie and watching Kareem Weaver, work with that student and say, A, Africa, B, Black, right? It's contextualized. That's the art. And Kareem has a great YouTube video on the art of teaching as well. But I think that's where we, as this conglomerate of the science of reading, I think we really have to be careful of falling to the idea of obedience to the script and obedience to, right. I think that's where we have to get the understanding of the principles correct, but we have to get that aspect of the giving teacher agency and allowing the art of teaching. I do want to follow that up, but the second part of that is I talk about intellectual humility. So we also have to talk about cultural humility. And we have to understand that with the science of reading, and when I started Mile, just as a side, that, was really bringing together my colleagues in the College of Education, and this is, and my co-director, this is a joint institute between Morgan State University, HBCU in Baltimore, and the University of Maryland, the two flagships in the state of Maryland, coming together to really focus on literacy. And my wonderful, wonderful friend and colleague, Dr. Simone Gibson, my co-director, she and I are constantly having these conversations with our faculty, and it's bringing together these ideas of the cultural humility. What is it that the science gets wrong? Or if not wrong, where's the blind spots in the science of reading? And I think, the work of Julie Washington and others really tries to illustrate some of this about, obviously there's a focus on dialect and language variation and we talk about, the multilingual learners. There's those aspects. There's also just that cultural humility is understanding that when we say to a child, oh, this is the way you say this word, this is that, right? That we have to understand that we need to take that humility of, this is academic English this is, school English that I'm bringing to you. But that there is the language that you're loved in, as Dr. Gibson will say, and that has to be embraced and understood and help children, as Julie and others will say, trans language. And so there's an embrace of children and culture in both their language background, their cultural background, the types of knowledge that they bring with their cultural background. I think that's one thing the science and the fields of reading research has yet to fully embrace. They're starting to dig their hands into this work. And I think of colleagues like Diana Leva, who's now at the University of Pittsburgh, and others. But I think it's understanding how different cultural knowledge comes into play and not just our decoding and early reading work, but also our deep comprehension, how we understand the world. Those things are set from our families, from our communities, from our cultures. And that's a cognitive construct as much as it is a humanizing construct, right? The schemas that we form, go back to schema theory, right? The schemas that we form are from those experiences. And so we need to embrace the schemas and understand the schemas that children come into the classroom with, as much as we do expect them to have, I think that's the assume aside that we make, is we expect children to have particular schemas or assume the ones that they have are irrelevant to the classroom.
Good humans, thank you for being on the road to literacy success with us. You just heard from neuroscientist Dr. Donald Joseph Bolger say that teachers change lives. You heard him also say that reading is complex. If you want to learn more from Dr. Bolger, hit the subscribe, because this is the first in the series, Beyond the Norm in the Science of Reading. Come on, we will continue to discover and explore how we can move beyond typical reading science information. See you next time.